It was the zenith of the Enlightenment, a time when Europe believed it had finally tamed chaos with the pure power of reason. For centuries, philosophers had assured mankind that suffering served a divine purpose, that the world was logically ordered, and that tragedy was simply a test of faith. But on this day, 268 years ago, the ground beneath Lisbon didn't just shake, it violently rejected that entire premise. At 9:40 a.m., November 1st, while thousands knelt in churches for All Saints' Day Mass, the earth unleashed a fury that lasted 7 terrifying minutes. The city collapsed. A massive tsunami rolled in to claim the fleeing survivors, and then came the purifying fire, consuming what the water could not touch. Survivors cried out for God's intervention, but the only voice that brought order was that of the single statesman who defied panic, the Marquês de Pombal, who declared, "What now? We bury the dead and feed the living." The Great Earthquake was not just a natural disaster, it was the intellectual catastrophe that fractured the age of reason, shattering the naive optimism of Europe in a single morning. How did this horrific tragedy fundamentally reshape the philosophy of giants like Voltaire? Why did the architects tasked with rebuilding Lisbon become the gravediggers of hope itself? And 268 years later, what does this 1st of November truly teach us about the cost of believing in an ordered universe? That hard, undeniable lesson began to be written not on a battlefield, but in the streets of Lisbon, on a holy day. It was November 1st, 1755, All Saints' Day. The air was thick with the incense of morning mass, but what followed was not communion, but punishment without warning. At 9:40 a.m., the ground began to tremble. Not a tremor, a sudden, deep, titanic convulsion, strong enough to shake the entire Iberian Peninsula, yet centered right beneath the sprawling wealth of the Portuguese capital. Cathedrals that had withstood centuries disintegrated in seconds, crushing thousands of faithful seeking refuge in their presumed sanctity. The earth fractured. Where there had been palaces and libraries, only a white cloud of dust and pulverized stone remained, shrouding the screams. The seismic horror was merely the prelude. The Tagus River water performed a bizarre retreat, draining from the harbor, exposing the muddy seabed, leaving behind a moment of unnatural, terrifying silence. Then, the wave came. A liquid wall estimated to be 20 feet high, sweeping away the survivors, the docks, the ships, and dragging the remnants of the fallen city back into the depths. 3 catastrophes in succession: tremor, fire, tsunami. More than 60,000 dead in hours. But the true victim was not the city. It was the idea. The Enlightenment's optimistic faith in divine providence, the certainty that mankind lived in the best of all possible worlds, collapsed along with the towers of the Say Cathedral. How could a just and benevolent God allow hell to visit the most devout Catholic capital in Europe, and specifically on the day dedicated to its saints? It was the ultimate contradiction. A wound not in the masonry, but in the European mind. This is not just the story of how Lisbon physically rebuilt itself. It is the story of how Europe was forced to reconstruct its very worldview, exchanging blind prayer for forensic science and submission for rational inquiry. The man who would attempt to bring order to the physical chaos was a ruthless pragmatist, the Marquês de Pombal. But the man who used this tragedy to fundamentally rewrite human thought was a writer watching the destruction unfold from hundreds of miles away. That distant observer was Voltaire, the reigning intellectual monarch of the Enlightenment, and the destruction he would witness was not merely physical ruin, but the unraveling of the philosophical paradise he and his peers had meticulously constructed. Lisbon in 1755 stood as the physical manifestation of that paradise. It was the antithesis of ruin, an opulent golden jewel nestled beside the Tagus River, built on oceanic highways that funneled gold from the New World into its heart. The city embodied the prevailing belief of the age, that the world was ordered, beautiful, and ultimately good. This was the age of reason, when thinkers across Europe dared to believe humanity was ascending, escaping the shadow of medieval darkness through sheer intellect. Gottfried Leibniz had famously declared this world the best of all possible worlds, a perfect mechanism calibrated by a benevolent creator. The symmetry of the cosmos confirmed the benevolence of providence, and Lisbon, with its countless spires and glittering wealth, was considered proof of God's favor. But under the surface of this golden wealth and marble piety, there were already tremors. Fissures not just in the foundations of the Baroque buildings, but deeper cracks in the very foundation of faith. The city's splendor was built on pride, and that pride, rooted in the belief in divine protection, would soon become a terrible vulnerability. The inhabitants walked daily through a vast, intricate laboratory of stone and devotion, entirely unaware that the experiment in human optimism was about to fail catastrophically. Governing this glittering stage was Sebastião José de Carvalho y Melo, the man history would know as the Marquês de Pombal. Unlike the philosophical dreamers who sought the divine blueprint, Pombal was cold, efficient reality. He was a modernizer with an iron will, an administrator who saw the city not through the lens of grace, but through the mechanics of power and political necessity. He cared little for theological debates, focusing instead on control, efficiency, and preparing Portugal for a political future. His preparations were strictly pragmatic, utterly divorced from any celestial intervention or natural upheaval. He represented the capacity for human action, a ruthless practicality that would soon clash violently with metaphysical despair. Now, the calendar moved toward the critical date, November 1st. In the Catholic world, this was the Feast of All Saints, Dia de Todos os Santos, a mandatory day of deepest reverence. It was a day when the pious population would gather in their most solemn structures. Every church, every chapel, every grand cathedral, from the largest monasteries to the humblest parish, would be packed shoulder to shoulder with the faithful, clad in their finest clothes, offering their most fervent prayers. They would kneel inside monuments designed to be eternal testaments to their devotion, unknowingly placing themselves directly beneath heavy columns and tons of carved stone ready to fall. The year 1755 was meant to be another marker in the relentless march of reason. Instead, as the bells rang out across Lisbon's hundreds of altars, ushering in the holy morning, they were unknowingly counting down the final terrifying seconds before the physical earth would finally rebel. The countdown ended precisely at 9:30 on that holy morning. In the heart of Lisbon, where thousands knelt, the silence was shattered by a sound no human had ever intended to hear. A deep subterranean groan that evolved instantly into a metallic infernal shriek, the sound of the planet tearing itself apart. The earth beneath their feet did not merely tremble. It heaved, it twisted, and then it began to dance with a lethal, impossible violence. Unlike the rapid, sharp shocks common in human history, this was a relentless, sustained torture, shaking Lisbon for a terrifying 6 full minutes, each second designed to dismantle a century of careful architecture and complacent faith. Buildings designed to stand for eternity swayed like reeds in a hurricane, their foundations dissolving into dust. The air filled with the deafening roar of falling stone, the grinding shriek of marble pillars collapsing, and the collective, primal scream of 80,000 souls simultaneously confronted by the impossible. The greatest irony played out in the city's heart. The churches, packed with devotees seeking grace, became the deadliest traps. Massive stone facades cracked and plummeted onto the congregations. The altars, the magnificent icons, the symbols of eternal refuge were instantly transformed into mountains of lethal rubble, burying the faithful indiscriminately, the saint, the sinner, the rich, the poor, all meeting the same swift crushing end under the weight of their own sacred structures. Those few who scrambled free witnessed a spectacle of absolute anarchy. The entire Baixa district, the grid of prosperous streets, was instantly flattened, a perfect, orderly civilization reduced to a sprawling, dusty pancake. The fortunate survivors, driven by instinct, fled the suffocating dust clouds and the continued tremors, seeking the only place that promised escape and open sky: the vast Praça do Comércio and the banks of the mighty Tagus River. They believed the worst was over. They were terribly, fatally wrong. Lisbon had suffered a single sudden heart attack, but the ensuing complications would ensure its complete destruction. Within the ruins, a second, slower catastrophe was brewing. All the oil lamps, all the holiday candles lit in devotion that morning had overturned. As the survivors watched from the riverfront, the dust settled only to reveal dozens of small, isolated fires beginning to bloom within the rubble, feeding voraciously on the dry timber and spilled supplies. A light breeze whispered through the destroyed city, merging the small flames into massive, hungry walls of fire. The inferno was methodical, unstoppable, and determined to claim every life the earthquake had spared. For those trapped inland, the choice was brutal: be crushed by the tremors or be consumed by the flames. But the greatest, most profound horror was yet to reveal itself, emerging not from the sky or the shaking ground, but from the water itself. As thousands gathered by the Tagus, coughing and weeping, seeking a drink, a blessing, or perhaps the means of escape, the great river began to behave in an unthinkable manner. It receded. Slowly at first, then rapidly, terrifyingly, pulling back from the shoreline, exposing the muddy bed where ships had anchored, revealing ancient wrecks and marine life that had not seen the light of day in centuries. This bizarre spectacle, though horrifying, drew hundreds more onto the exposed seabed, their minds perhaps seeking salvage or simply paralyzed by shock, unable to comprehend the universal law being violated before their eyes. The Tagus River, the lifeline of Lisbon, was emptying itself, but nature abhors a vacuum, and the sea was merely inhaling before delivering a definitive, annihilating blow. About 40 minutes after the initial tremor, a distant, muffled roar grew louder, promising something immense coming from the ocean. Then, on the horizon, the water returned. It was no longer the familiar, comforting river. It was a liquid mountain, towering perhaps 50 feet high, an opaque wall of destruction charging inland. It hit the unsuspecting crowds on the seabed, and the survivors huddled by the commerce square with the force of a divine executioner, sweeping away people, rubble, and ships as if they were fragile toys. 3 titanic waves slammed into the shore, each one penetrating deep into the city, extinguishing the worst of the fires but simultaneously dragging thousands back into the cold, churning depths. By the time the sea finally subsided, the physical Lisbon was gone. Its palaces, its archives, its magnificent royal opera house, all vanished. But the physical destruction was merely the stage setter for the true trauma, the one that resonated across the continent and haunted the halls of the Enlightenment. This calamity was not a siege, nor a plague, nor a war that could be blamed on human corruption or folly. It was a blind, impersonal act of cosmic indifference. For the philosophers and optimists who believed in a meticulously designed, benevolent universe, Voltaire among them, the 1st of November 1755, provided a devastating, unanswerable contradiction. How could a perfectly good God allow such random, massive suffering, striking down the innocent in the very act of worship on a sacred day in a city supposedly favored by grace? This was the terrible, undeniable truth that emerged from the rubble. If this world was the best of all possible worlds, then perhaps God was not good. Or worse still, perhaps God was simply brutally absent. The philosophical earthquake had begun, shaking the very foundations of Western thought. That brutal absence of God was not merely a pain to bear, but an existential crisis that demanded a fundamental reckoning. The optimistic world of the Enlightenment, built on the faith in reason and divine order, was suddenly forced to stare into the abyss. How could a supposedly perfect world contain such random, monumental cruelty? The destruction of Lisbon was not just a natural disaster, it was a direct assault on the very concept of providence. No single thinker embodied this intellectual revolt better than Voltaire. For years he had been a sharp, witty skeptic, but the screams rising from the Lisbon rubble annihilated his former stance, transforming him into a furious, heartbroken cynic. His seminal work, The Poem on the Disaster of Lisbon, was the final hammer blow to the pillars of Leibnizian optimism. He questioned, without compromise, the fundamental contract between man and God. If this is truly the best of all possible worlds, what horrific state must the rest be in? The earthquake did not just shake the ground, it shattered the comforting illusion that human suffering had some grand, divine purpose. It left behind the terrifying truth: chaos is sovereign. But while the philosophers debated the soul of God and the nature of evil in coffee houses across Europe, one intensely practical man acted upon the city's bones. The Marquês of Pombal had no time for penitence, for sermons, or for metaphysical dread. When asked what should be done, his famous reply was not a prayer, but a decree embodying a new, stark secularism. And now, bury the dead, and feed the living. Pombal understood the political opportunity presented by absolute catastrophe. November 1st, 1755, handed him, and by extension the state, the absolute authority needed to bypass the church, silence dissent, and govern by purely rational principles. Lisbon needed science, engineering, and cold, hard power, not theology. The first modern principles of urban planning, from prefabricated buildings to uniform, earthquake-resistant grids, were born in that horror. The city was not rebuilt for aesthetics or divine glory, but for survival. Lisbon was reconstructed, designed to endure the next tectonic shock. But the European mind was also fundamentally rebuilt, designed to distrust. The optimistic rationalism of the pre-earthquake age was buried beneath the rubble of All Saints' Day. The belief in the universe's absolute order was replaced by the acceptance of brutal, meaningless randomness. The center of gravity in Western thought had shifted permanently from divine justification to human responsibility. The Marquês of Pombal proved it was possible to save the city's body and secure its future through human effort. But Voltaire, in his devastating critique, revealed that the catastrophe had murdered something far more fragile and foundational: humanity's philosophical innocence. This is why, 268 years later, the echo of November 1st still rings true. We cannot depend on a benevolent force to save the world. We must depend only on ourselves and the strength of our own imperfect designs. If the earth shook and the sea swallowed the thriving capital, something far more profound collapsed in the collective soul of Europe. The Enlightenment, in its heady optimism, promised order, reason, and an architect God who had designed a perfect, predictable world. The prevailing philosophy maintained that all pain, even great catastrophe, was merely a necessary component of the best of all possible worlds. But on November 1st, 1755, at the exact moment the faithful knelt in prayer, that carefully constructed theory collapsed alongside the churches. The blind brutality of the tectonic shift spared neither the righteous nor the sinner. It made no distinction between the sacred cathedral and the alleyway brothel. This was not the calculated vengeance of an angry deity. This was the cruel, unthinking indifference of nature itself. For the first time, humanity was forced to confront the most terrifying possibility of all: that perhaps there was no grand design. There was no elevated purpose in Lisbon's suffering, only relentless, geological chaos. It is this fundamental fracture in Western thought, this profound challenge to faith opened 268 years ago, that still echoes in our modern search for meaning. The Lisbon earthquake was the definitive moment European optimism died, and a modern world, skeptical, self-aware, and defined by doubt, was born upon the smoking ruins.